Yeah, so welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight on our panel discussion of Yemen 5 years after the revolution. I'm Courtney Freer. I'm a research officer at the Kuwait program here at LSE. And I'll be just chairing, not saying much because I'm woefully uninformed about Yemen, as I think many people are. But in any case, this event is part of a series of events put on by the LSE MENA Society to mark the 5 years after the Arab Spring. They had an event on Monday about Egypt. They'll also have a panel discussion on Bahrain and Libya in February, and also events in March on Syria and Tunisia. But tonight, as you know, we're focused on Yemen. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is #YemenLSE. So now I'll just go ahead and introduce speakers in the order in which they speak. I think they'll speak for about 15 minutes each. So we have Baraa Shiban, who's a Yemeni human rights activist and Yemen project coordinator for the human rights organization Reprieve. He was also a member of Yemen's National Dialogue from 2012 to 2014. We also have Adam Baran, who's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and was based in Sana'a from 2011 till 2014, where he worked as a journalist, and a lot of you are probably familiar with his work. We also have Rasha Mohamed, who's a Yemen researcher at Amnesty International, and Nawal Al-Maghafi, who's a Yemeni-British journalist and filmmaker whose work you may have seen on Channel 4, BBC Newsnight, BBC World, BBC Arabic, and Middle East Times. So I guess we'll get started. Baraa, you want to start off?
Thank you. At the beginning, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the LSE MENA Society for organizing the event, and thanks for LSE for hosting us today on Yemen, and specifically talking about the revolution. Where are we today after it's almost 4 years? The events and the circumstances that were prior to the revolution, I think, were very important. Every country in the Arab Spring had its own circumstances that led to a popular movement. You cannot literally compare each country to the other, so there isn't a clear comparison. You can just pick a pen and make a line and say this is exactly like this country, or this country is exactly like this country. But the general circumstances, you might find it very similar. In 2010, late 2010, Saleh went to the parliament, and he tried. The former president Saleh went to the parliament, and he tried to pass new amendments to the Yemeni constitution. The new amendments were many amendments, but the main core of that amendment that it would allow him to run for presidency again, and it said that it would allow for more people to participate in presidential elections, but actually it gives him the ability to run multiple times, which means, in other words, that he has the right to be the president indefinitely. The situation was very tense in Yemen because the parliamentary elections were delayed for 2 years. So we were supposed to have a parliamentary election in 2008, and that got also delayed for 2 years. And then Saleh made an interesting quote when he went to the parliament. He said, if the opposition are not going to run for the parliamentary elections, the GPC, his party, are going to run by themselves. They're going to run alone. I'm pretty sure that Saleh didn't know what was coming. Didn't know that there were major events would happen in the region. Started with Tunisia, then quickly to Egypt. And to be honest, a lot of the I would say Arab leaders didn't focus pretty much on what happened in Tunisia specifically. Yeah, it's something very bad for them that an Arab president or an Arab leader have left power. But that might be like just one case scenario that just happened in Tunisia and wouldn't replicate itself in other countries. But when Egypt happened, that's when everyone really started to get very afraid. The GPC called their people, they called their members across the country, and they started to prepare what are we going to do if a mass protests went to the streets calling for the departure of Ali Abdullah Saleh, calling simply for Saleh to step down. They occupied the main square in Sana'a, that's called Tahrir Square. So Tahrir Square in Sana'a was occupied by GPC Saleh supporters, and then the opposition party said we're gonna do one-day protest on the 3rd of February. The protest was big, was massive, but quite interestingly that not the opposition parties by themselves went to those protests. People from different factions of the society went out, and they were calling very clearly for the fall of Saleh. That was 7 days before Mubarak stepped down from power. Everyone knew that something massive, something big is gonna happen, and everyone was very much looking closely to what's gonna happen in Egypt. If the events in Egypt, if the revolution in Egypt turned to be very successful, something would happen in Yemen. Mubarak stepped down on the 10th of February. On the 11th of February, a group of youth in the city of Taz, central Yemen, went to the squares and called clearly for the fall of Saleh and his regime. They were a group of, I would say, independent, left-wing activists, but their message quite had an echo. People from houses, from different streets, were just walking together and say, maybe that's it. Saleh is no longer fit to run the country. After a week, the protests grew massive in Taz, and then it started in Sana'a. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Tawakkul Karman. She led the first protest in Sana'a, and she was heavily beaten that day. And then many people came together. I would like to quickly give a brief picture of what was happening in 2011 and then jump forward quickly. So who were the people who went to the streets? If you talk to the Islamist parties, they're going to say, we are the ones who ran the protests. We're the one who financed the protests and funded people to sit in the street, because having a revolution costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of effort, and only organized groups like the Islamist parties can run such a show. If you talk to the leftist parties, they're going to say, no, actually, our youth were the first ones who went to the streets and called for the protests. If we're going to talk to the, let's say, independent activists or human rights activists and the civil society activists, they're going to say, no, actually, at the beginning, the Islamist party and the JMP parties and all the political parties were willing to negotiate with Saleh. They weren't actually looking for a revolution. But because of the demands of the streets were very high, they had, in a way, to blend in within the mass protest and call for the fall of Saleh. The reality is, it's a mixture of all of those together. The ability of the revolution that was able to bring all those factions together from different parts of the country, and basically the message was one, and it's quite clear and simple. Anyone who wants to call for the fall of Saleh and his family, he can come to the Freedom and Change Squares and join the protests and call for this for this to happen. This ability to bring different factions of the society together is what affected the revolution later on, because at the beginning, from the right to the left, if you would be a conservative or liberal, whatever your affiliation is, you have one common goal. And for me, as a person who was there in the revolution, and I started protesting with my colleagues in Sana'a University in February 2011. But then I went to meet people in Taz, meet people in Aden, and meet with the various different groups in an attempt to unify the demands of the youth revolution. We did succeed in unifying and coming up with a document that very specifically specifies 10 demands of the Yemeni revolution. But this attempt didn't go any further. We were not able to unite all those factions together in one clear plan. What are we going to do if Saleh tonight stepped down from power? Who is going to be in charge? And we were very much driven by this revolutionary idea. We don't need to be in politics. We call the change from here, from down on the street. But the reality is that if you are not a member of a political party, if you don't try to organize yourself within the political structure, someone else who is within the system is going to come and say, thank you very much, I'm going to take it from here. And that's exactly what happened. When there was a GCC initiative, I still believe until today that the youth made one of the biggest mistakes by saying we're not going to be part of the GCC initiative. Because what happened is that the political parties took that initiative, went to the GCC countries and said, we're willing to sign the initiative. And simply, when they come back to Yemen, they were saying, yeah, it's not a perfect solution, but it actually guarantees that Saleh and his family would leave power. There is a reconstruction of the military. And some of that, yes, did happen. But the voice of the youth were missing in that process. And that's what we learned as we were going forward. The other, I would say, mistake we did in the revolution is that we underestimated what's a counter-revolution. And it's very simple. If you have members of the former regime, it could be the same people, it could be a different type of people, but they're going to try to come back to power. If not in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, eventually they're going to try to come back to power. And many of us did underestimate what's going to happen. And the third, I would say, mistake committed by not just the youth, but all the groups that came together, is that the period after the revolution is going to be much harder than before the revolution. So you need a very competent government to run the show. You need a very strong body and a very strong leader who can really make the calls and make strong and decisive decisions. And that, unfortunately, in the Yemeni case, wasn't the case. Talking about moving forward, the national dialogue happened, and the aim of the national dialogue was that we bring all of those together, even the youth, even the women, and the civil society, and let's come up with the new constitution and the new electoral system. Although that did happen, but the period from when the revolution did end until the national dialogue was able to conclude and coming with a final document, Saleh had already mobilized his own people. He brought the tribal leaders together. Many of the people who were marginalized after 2011, many of his party members who were affected by the events of 2011, brought them together. And he benefited from one group specifically, and those are the Houthis. The Houthis had local grievances. They fought with the Yemeni government for 6 years, and they were looking for power. They were craving for power. It's their time. It's their chance to be a strong power as the political parties on the ground. When you have all of those circumstances, that resulted in a perfect example of a counter revolution. Saleh mobilized his men and eventually started cracking down on all of the members who were part of the revolution. Now, we made a very simple mistake in Yemen and said Saleh or the Houthis are only targeting their opponents, and specifically some tribal leaders of being historical tribal leaders called the Ahmar family, some members of the Islah party, the Islamist party, and that's it. But that's one of the biggest mistakes, because Saleh didn't just mobilize the Houthis, he mobilized the army, the tribal leaders, and they cracked down on all the members, all senior leaders who either defected from him in 2011 or participated in the revolution in 2011. And later on, all the journalists, activists inside Sana'a who were once protesting against Saleh were being arrested by the Houthis this time. And to be more specific, it's not just the Houthis and the military forces mobilized by Saleh. The situation after 2014 and the inability to bring the groups together to be unified towards having a coming elections and having the new constitution did pretty much affected how Yemen, and resulted in why are we in this situation today. Many of the villages and family members who were once protesting peacefully, their homes were blown up by the Houthis. The villages were destroyed, and this is all of this before 2015. This is late 2014. Many of the people were arrested and killed, and the common factor was that those are an enemy of Saleh. It could also work as an enemy of the Houthis, and this is what actually benefited Saleh, and why is he still in Sana'a today? Today, if you see the current situation, Saleh is the one in Sana'a. His nephews are running the fights on the ground, actually, and the other forces are outside. Now, some of them have returned back to the south of Yemen, or to the east of Yemen, but the military have pretty much is still working with the former president. Finally, I would like to say the revolution is a continuous effort. It doesn't stop at a certain limit. It could sometimes take the shape of a violent movement, but definitely something has changed in Yemen, and definitely Yemen will not look like it was before 2011 and before 2015. The Yemeni people, many of the youth are still looking for a modern civil state. Many of them are still there looking for a better future. And that's why, when currently the events happening, many of the youth revolution said we cannot be with the Houthis because we have the right as people not to be run by a militia, but by a state. And if that means that we're going to have new elections, new constitutions, then so be it. But we have the right to call for a civil country, a new, modern, civil, democratic country, not to be run by a militia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really useful overview, kind of taking us back to 2011. And so I'll move on to Adam.
During the French Revolution, a man named Georges Danton, who was one of the leaders of the revolution, found himself, due to a twist of fate, being led to the guillotine. And as he was led by the guillotine, he allegedly, and probably actually didn't, but people always say he did, uttered a very famous sentence. He said, "Like Saturn, the revolution devours its children." And in Yemen, the revolution has just not devoured its children. In Yemen, the revolution has actually vomited its children up to devour them again. This comes, I think, back to, well, so in that sense, that will be sort of a theme of my remarks, how the revolution in Yemen has repeatedly devoured its children. So, I mean, it starts to 2011. Effectively in 2011, you have a state that is in crisis. You have a series of deep crises that are interconnected but also separate, dealing with Yemen. In the north, you have the Houthi insurgency, where the army, led by Ali Abdullah Saleh, and with the participation of a man named Ali Mohsen, who I'll get to in a second, fight 6 extremely brutal wars in Saada against a group called the Houthis, who are fighting, well, I mean, it was very complicated, fighting for a lot of things, fighting, they say, against corruption, for religious expressions, but basically is a revivalist community in a province that was largely marginalized. And eventually you have the classic case in a situation like this, where they fought against, the destruction brings more people to the Houthis, and despite these 6 brutal wars and a Saudi bombing campaign, this is a Saudi bombing campaign, it's completely separate from the current Saudi bombing campaign, the Houthis ended up, on the eve of the revolution in 2011, stronger, I would say, than they had ever been since their start. So you have that in the far north. In the south, you have the fallout from Yemen's botched 1990 unification. Prior to 1990, Yemen was 2 countries. The communist, indeed the only Marxist state in the entire Middle East, People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which was led by a series of different leaders owing to a frequent tendency for how would we put this? You know, the classic curse of the communist states of binges and purges. Once again, the revolution devouring its children, albeit a different revolution. And 1990, you have Ali Abdullah Saleh, obviously leading Yemen. It seemed like a great idea at the time for both sides, but as the unification happened, it quickly fell apart to the point where at 1994, you have a number of forces largely led by a man named Ali Salam al-Bid, who is, well, I mean, he was in exile in Oman, then he was in exile in Lebanon, and now he's in exile in Abu Dhabi, fighting against largely northern, but not entirely northern, pro-unity forces. Ironically, the defense minister at that time was a man named Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, who later became Saleh's vice president after the war. So after 1994 and the crackdown, and the subsequent crackdown and purge of many Southerners from the army, from the civil society, from the civil service, from the Yemeni government, you have understandably building grievances. Southerners felt not only that they had lost...
This way, they're filming.
Southerners felt not only that they had been marginalized, but indeed that their identity and that their very identity and history was being eliminated, that they had lost their state and control over their own destiny. You quickly have these building grievances turn into something in 2007 called the Southern Movement, a loosely organized, to put it one way, amorphous blob of different factions, leaders, tribal leaders, organizations, etc., all united against the idea of returning some form of autonomy, ranging from in a federal system all the way to full independence in the South. Saleh cracks down, and in a similar situation with the Houthis, the crackdowns only deepen people's determination to move forward with the state. On the eve of 2011, the Southern Movement was also growing. We also have two other issues. We have the internal structure. When Ali Saleh became president of Yemen, he did that as part of a number of key figures within the regime. His right-hand man for years was Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar, until for some time one of the most powerful leaders in the country. As Saleh's kids came of age, the pieces of the pie had to get divided into smaller areas. So the bedrock of Saleh's role was the patronage system of politics. So as the pieces of the pie get smaller, or as the pie has to get divided in increasing numbers of pieces, sort of the elite dynamics within the regime caused deepening tensions. So at that point you had, in the eve of 2011, you had tensions within the Saleh regime, within the heart of the Saleh regime. We're talking between Saleh's family and his key partners from the point of him reaching power at their highest degree of tensions. Then finally, you have the issue, well, I guess not finally, then in addition to this, you have the JMP, the establishment opposition having their deepest tensions with Saleh at any point in their history. The key proponent of the JMP, in addition to a number of leftist factions, is the Islah Party. The Islah Party was founded in 1990 by Sheikh Abdullah bin Hussein Al-Ahmar, who was one of Saleh's closest allies until his death. But in a similar faction, once Islah, along with their partners, their then allies from Saleh's party, began to succeeded in sort of marginalizing Southerners, you had the deep tensions begin to burst forth, starting largely at first with the formation of the JMP, which was in opposition. Coalition formed in explicit opposition to Saleh, which there's a deep irony there in the sense that Islah had endorsed Saleh's election as president on a number of cases. And then so you have the tensions there, these deep tensions between the establishment and opposition. Finally, you have the demographic and economic issues of the fact that Yemen was a country that was getting poor, getting with a larger population, and relying largely on oil revenues that were drying up by the day. So of course 2011 happens, and we have a catalyst to this gasoline-soaked drag of different societal tensions. So you initially have a largely independent, even if some were from different parties, the fact of the matter is they were independent-minded groups of youth from different parties. That immediately different factions began to take in to speak in the name of the revolution. So the first time the revolution devoured its own children, one could say, is when the JMP came in and sort of took charge. As Baraa said, I think you really summed it up very well in the sense that you had youth sort of lacking a real organization. So it was not surprising that you had sort of establishment factions come in. The second time the revolution devoured its own children was when El-Effendi Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar and his branch of the military split with Saleh, taking advantage of the March 18th Jumat al-Qurama massacre, where pro-Saleh troops engaged in what was until recently considered one of the bloodiest days in Yemen's history. Unfortunately, now it doesn't seem that bloody by comparison after the past year and a half. But what was at that time one of the bloodiest days of Yemen's history and the bloodiest day of the Yemeni Revolution, in which pro-Saleh troops opened fire on a number of unarmed demonstrators, leading a flurry of defections from the camp, the most notable one being Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmar, who entered into the fore and quickly rose to present himself as a leader of the revolution. I remember very much a speech he made quickly after that, I think it was at Eid al-Adha, where he addressed the Yemeni people, which really testified to the fact that this was not just a matter of a man saying that history had passed and it was time to embrace change. This was a man feeling that his time had come. So you move forward and the GCC deal goes into effect. By the end of 2011, you have a new Yemeni government led by Hadi, a former regime stalwart, and split between the establishment opposition and members of Saleh's party. So it was a true irony in the sense that you had supposedly a revolution, and yet you have a cabinet made up completely of very familiar faces, and then a president who had been the deputy of the person that Yemenis had revolted against, leading the country. In some sense, once again, the revolution devouring its children. The cabinet proved ineffective at resolving the deep crises facing Yemen, both due to the economy, both in terms of the economy, in terms of security, and due to the fact that a number of elements of the former regime were very keen to make sure that nothing could happen for things to move forward. And there was a great degree, I mean, the word at the time, it was often employed by the UN in various speeches with spoilers. Certain factions of the former regime, including Saleh himself, were very eager to spoil the transition. At the same time, in the midst of the power vacuum, the Houthis, using the fact that they are outside of the cycle, use this as an opportunity to begin to pick up more and more support. They say, protesting against the supposed corruption of the government, protesting against asserting that the revolution must continue, which now, of course, is tremendous irony due to their alliance of convenience with former President Saleh, but at the time it was a powerful, at the time it was able to attract people to their cause. The national dialogue process moves forward, but fails to end in anything conclusive or any true change. A constitutional drafting process moves forward, but at the same time, events on the ground outside of Sana'a eventually overwhelm Sana'a itself. So this bubble that was the transition, that was occurring in the halls of the Movenpick Hotel, that was occurring in the hotel, the Tashiba and the Diwans of Sana'a, suddenly was overwhelmed when you hit September 21st and the Houthis take over Sana'a. An agreement signed, no one respects it. The Houthis being very famous for being very keen to sign agreements, but not particularly keen on living up to them. And as we move forward, the tensions continue to build until they erupt for the first time about a year ago to this day. Well, actually, slightly less than a year ago, or slightly more than a year ago, because when the Houthis kidnap and abduct Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, Hadi's closest aide. 2 weeks later, roughly speaking, after putting the entire government and Hadi under house arrest, after the Houthis finally managed to push the government, at that point led by Khalid Baha, and Hadi to resign from office. They then put them under an even more stringent house arrest. This bizarre crisis continues for 3 weeks as the Houthis consolidate power with the aid of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Tensions move back and forth, and the Houthis grow increasingly, we would say, confident, until finally they engage in 3 acts that serve to provoke the Saudis into taking action. First, they sign a deal inking direct plane ties, flight routes between Tehran, where I think the agreement stated that there would be up to 14 flights a week carried out by Yemenia, Yemen's national airlines, and Mahan Air, an Iranian airline, providing direct links between Sana'a and Tehran. Of course, this was a tremendous sign towards Riyadh, which had always been very anxious about the Houthis owing to their existent, though often exaggerated, links towards Iran. The second action is when the Houthis and the Yemeni army launch a military exercise on the Saudi, quite adjacent to the Saudi border. The third is when the Houthis, deeply frustrated that Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi had not left the country, having fled to Aden after somehow escaping from house arrest, used the Yemeni Air Force to bomb the internationally recognized Yemeni president in his own house. These things, which all occurred back to back, lead the newly, I guess you can say, inaugurated King Salman to take action. And thus we have, ironically, as Hadi himself was on a boat fleeing, or either on a boat or in a car, fleeing Aden for Oman, we have the launch of something called Decisive Storm. Everyone thought it would be over in a few weeks. I think the thought from many was that this would be a repeat of the Kuwait War, that the Houthis would be rolled back. And when I say it, but most people who knew Yemen well knew that this was only the beginning of another stage in a conflict that will go on for some time. I'll let Nawal and Rasha deal with more of sort of the fallout, but essentially what we've seen now is the power struggle that has been emanating between different forces continuing in an even more bloody and gory way. Ali Abdullah Saleh, and for that matter the Houthis, have been given by the Saudi airstrikes sort of a reason and a justification to crack down on their political opponents, both armed and unarmed, in as brutal a way as possible. Brandishing Yemeni patriotism and resistance against the invaders as they continue to take action and engage in what some have alleged are war crimes. Simultaneously, various other Yemeni factions have been gifted, from the various other old regime factions, have been gifted a tremendous opportunity to use the fight against the Houthis and the fight against Saleh to shore up their own fortunes, backing a number of various armed groups that are currently fighting the Houthis in the north and the south, in the far north, and largely in the south and center of the country. Where does this leave the ideas of the civil democratic states that led many Yemenis to take to the streets in 2011? They're still there. And I think what was unleashed is not something that's going to go away, even if it's sidetracked. After all, it's hard to speak of a civil democratic state when bombs are raining from the sky and shells are being launched back and forth, and militias are laying siege to one of the key cities that actually led to the birth of everything that happened in 2011. But unfortunately, as we look at the situation in Yemen 5 years after the revolution started, the same people that Yemenis took to the streets to revolt against, who now fall, ironically, on different sides of a war, fighting each other, as the vast majority of Yemenis are caught in the middle. I'll pass things up to Nawal.
Thanks very much. I think that was about as succinct a summation as one could make of what's been going on in Yemen. A bit depressing, but hopefully, I don't know if we'll lift the mood at all. But anyway, I'll turn to Rasha now.
So I'll be speaking more about the human rights issues and international humanitarian law issues from an Amnesty documentation perspective. So obviously when the political transition was derailed last January, I was in the capital when it happened, diplomatic missions pulled out, the Houthis took over military institutions, there was fighting inside Sana'a, they took over the presidential palace, of course it led to the resignation of the government and then moving to Aden. And very quickly, as Adam said, when they bombarded Saudi over the border, the palace in Aden, and then when they set up those flights between Iran and Sana'a, of course it gave them every reason to start this coalition. So we woke up on the 26th and suddenly Sana'a was being bombed, Sada and Sana'a. And this coalition, I mean, what can we say about the coalition? I mean, what we have documented in Amnesty is that all parties to the conflict have committed violations of IHL, and most of them amount to war crimes and should be investigated as war crimes. So there's no other one party that's worse than the other. They've all played a part in this. Obviously, it's led to a very acute humanitarian situation. The country's already poor, so we're talking about majority of people who are killed are civilians, over 2,700 at this stage, hundreds of them children. We're talking about people who were already displaced from the 6 years war. Now we're talking about extra displacement of around 1.5 million, so it adds up to 2.5 million returned displaced people, plus the movement of refugees to Djibouti and such worsened over the year. What I'm going to cover really quickly, because we could be here all day about the human rights situation, is I'm going to talk to you about how the armed groups have committed violations of IHL, the international humanitarian law. I'm going to talk to you about what the Saudi Local Coalition has done inside, and we can briefly touch on maybe Taz as an example of a humanitarian situation that needs attention. And then on the ground, parallel to all of this, there are many issues. The Houthis detaining people, the Houthis cracking down on NGOs, these issues that don't come to the fore because the war and the killing civilians is so red in everyone's eyes. So from our missions, we've carried out 4 missions in the last year. The last time I was there was in July when Aden was taken back. And I was in Aden when that happened. And we visited Sa'da, Hudayda, Sana'a, Taiz, and Aden and Ib in 1 month. And all over the country, since March until now, we have looked at armed groups' conduct on the ground. And Houthi armed groups were amalgamation of Saleh loyalists and the Houthis themselves, and anti-Houthi groups, which are an amalgamation of a million other groups that we're not going to go into, have all committed violations of international humanitarian law. What we found is that these groups operate within civilian areas that are full of civilians in the middle of neighborhoods, houses. So what happens is when you're inside a neighborhood under IHL and you're shooting at the other side in another neighborhood and the other side replies, that's not allowed because we're talking about principles of distinction, proportionality. You're supposed to look at, okay, is this attack going to give me more of a military objective? Are there civilians in the area? Should we give them a warning? Should we clear out and fight in the desert, not in the middle of houses? When we looked at the actual attacks, specifically in Aden and Taz, we saw that we examined weapon remnants on the sites of attacks. You see kind of weapons that are used that have wide area effect. So you're talking about mortars, Grad rockets, RPGs, tanks, and that means these weapons are not, what wide area effect means that they can't aim properly. And so they have a bigger kind of scope when they land. You're just aiming roughly. So what we found, for example, in the south, in Aden, and if we include Taz, at least 68 civilians were killed, and 99 were injured. In just 30 attacks, we looked at 30. We're talking about hundreds here that have been carried out since March between the two groups. So attacks by both sides have not distinguished between fighters and civilians. And what we saw is that they're operating within the neighborhoods and therefore basically put people in danger, at risk. I won't go into the boring technicalities of the law, but I'll give you an example. For example, in Aden, we looked into like 15 different attacks. And what happens is that if you go to an area that's controlled by anti-Houthi armed groups who might call themselves Muqawma, just one big term for them, and might base their checkpoints inside civilian areas. The Houthis might hit that checkpoint and might kill a couple of fighters, but kill 50 other people with them that are civilians. So one area that we looked into was Block 405, which is near the prison in Aden. There was a checkpoint, they killed 1 fighter, but then they killed 13 civilians and 56 were injured. That's just, you have to look at the principle of how they weigh it out. If we go to Taz, the dynamics were similar, but Taz is surrounded by mountains. So the Houthis were on the mountains, so they had better positioning into the city to hit the opposition groups. If you look at Taz, kids were playing basically in alleyways, and a mortar would land and a shrapnel would kill them on the spot. We looked at maybe 16 or 20 different attacks in Taz, and we featured the best of them. But if the problem with these weapons is that both sides are doing this. One side is replying as well as the other one initiating. So they're all in the wrong. They shouldn't be fighting in the middle of civilians. And they force people out of their homes. Some of them are already refugees and living in new homes, and they're attacked in their new homes. Then from the armed group perspective, we also have seen them attack medical facilities. Now, people talk about Saudi-led coalition hitting medical facilities, but armed groups have also attacked medical facilities in Taz and in Aden. When we were in Aden, we saw it for ourselves. You can see them firing from inside and beside hospitals, from beside and inside schools, which are all civilian infrastructure, and you're not supposed to operate from within or beside them. And that means the fire would return. You can see armed groups storming the ICRC hospital. It's the state of lawlessness didn't really help in Aden. In Taz, we visited Al-Thawra, Al-Rawda hospital, and we can see there when you went daily attacks of mortars and rockets. And of course, under international law, these institutions and these facilities are supposed to be protected. And they're not supposed to ever be military objectives unless there's a reason that you think they've been used for military objectives, which has to take a lot of proof. When we, of course, come to the Saudi-led coalition, as I said, we've looked into many airstrikes in all those areas we've visited. We've documented up to now 33 unlawful airstrikes across Yemen. But that's just us. Of course, other organizations have documented more, and that's the capacity we've been able to do it at. But I'll give you an example. We visited one village in Saada, and the village was a cluster of like 9 houses. They're made of mud. The infrastructure, like how things are built in Yemen, is very simple and very traditional. So you go, and they're completely flattened. 4 to 8 bombs were dropped on the village. 55 people were killed, 35 of which were children. All of them under the age of 12. So when someone argues that this was a legitimate attack and there was Houthis present in the area, or Saada is controlled by the Houthis, that cannot be argued in this case. Because we're talking about, if the Houthis are present, it doesn't give them legitimacy to attack that place without giving prior warning so people can clear. When they declare the north of the country a military zone, that doesn't happen in international law. You're supposed to give people warning, there has to be justifications, they have to be able to exit, they had no cars, they had to walk out of the place, there was no petrol. So you're talking about collective punishment in some format here. Same in Aden and in the south of the country, in Sana'a. What we found is that where people would seek shelter is where they would get hit. For example, we visited some schools, and those schools were like people were displaced because of another airstrike. The school would be hit, and mostly women and children would die because they're the ones who stay at home. So if you look at our casualty list, it's mostly women and children, actually, not men. Because men tend to be outside trying to get food or make money or whatever it is. Another devastating thing to think about is if Yemen ever gets past this, it's the destruction of the infrastructure. We're talking about bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, facilities, communication towers, electricity grids, water towers. It's all non-existent. It was already a poor country and was already being funded by hundreds of states, and now we're talking about below basic. There's nothing. And well, on the way to Saada, for example, there are 4 bridges. It's a long road up the mountains. During 5 days, we went up and we saw one bridge hit, completely broken, and what the aim of that would be to obstruct the movement of military armed groups who might be transferring weapons. So the military armed groups can just go under the bridge on their 4x4s and continue. It's the normal civilian aid can be delivered. So if you think of thousands of tons of flour going underneath a bridge on a rocky road, it can't do it. So the aid can't get to that area. On the way back 5 days later, all four bridges were destroyed. We witnessed it for ourselves. We counted 25 trucks on the way to Saada that were hit. Petrol tankers, livestock, vegetables, ambulances. It's moving trucks, infrastructure, and we saw the same thing in Aden. When they were trying to take Aden back, they also bombed things to try to impede the Houthis movement around. Same in bridges connecting Hodeidah, Taiz, Ma'arib, all of it is destroyed. So movement has become very, very difficult even for humanitarian organizations. It's become a daily reality where they can't move around. The coalition has apparently decided that hospitals are the best target in the last couple of months. And I mean, I think a lot of you who follow MSF have come out with something about this in the last week. And we've looked into one of the attacks of the MSF hospitals in the south and the north of the country. And what's interesting is, I think, the silence of the international community. When Kunduz was hit in Afghanistan, there was a big fuss kicked up. When there are 4 hospitals hit, run by MSF in Yemen, no, not a peep out of anyone. And that is really frightening. Because when you go to those areas and you see how basic their care is, when you see they don't even have anesthetic, I saw it for myself. They were carrying out basic surgeries without the tools. It is scary to see these people not having the basic clinics that they had in the area. I just want to pull up the map, if that's okay. Just to sum up, I'm not going to go into much longer, but obviously the humanitarian situation is really bad, and the latest research we've been doing has been on Taiz. And we've been talking to people on the ground in Taiz who are besieged inside the city. So I just want to explain to you how they're getting food into Taiz, because all the entrances to Taiz are controlled by the Houthis, and there's only one entrance that opens and closes, and it's very sporadic. Yeah, sure, take your time. So basically in Taiz, there are maybe 6, there you go.
Yes.
So I don't know if you can really see this, but you have it, yeah. Okay, so south of here is Aden, here's the Taiz, city of Taiz. I just want to point out to you, this is the smuggling route. Do you see how mountainous this range is? It's 6,000 meters above sea level. So you're talking about even cars can't access this. So what happens is that usually there's fighting here. So they go through the fighting, they start here, they drive to here, then to here, and then they walk this. This takes 3 hours to walk, this small distance. Then a car collects them and takes them into Taiz, and there's fighting here. So there's stuff being thrown in that direction. This is the only entrance into the city that's functional right now, that's been controlled by the Houthis. And this used to be functional, but they closed it 3 months ago. So what's happening is that the poorest of the poorest that were already poor in Taiz can't afford what's being smuggled into Taiz because it costs extra to smuggle stuff. Because to carry up food, you need a donkey, and a donkey used to cost 7,000 Yemeni riyals, now it costs 100,000 to buy a donkey so it can carry up your stuff, because it's an uphill, so donkeys are better, or camels. So the food inside Taiz is being sold at 5-10 times the price. So what people try to do is exit into Houthi areas to the west through that checkpoint and go here to Bir Basha, where food is only half of that price. And what happens is they come back to the checkpoint, they're carrying their tomatoes, they're dragging a gas cylinder. The Houthis give them a hard time. They might open the gas cylinder and let the gas escape. They might grab a bag of tomatoes and just like stamp on it, and they say to them, you're only allowed half a kilo, and they take half of it. Sometimes what's happening is they're trying to arrest young men. So now women go, and women are being held in the checkpoint for absolute hours. They might be there at 9 a.m., they let them wait until 4, they close the checkpoint, and they're like, okay, you're gonna have to go sleep over there by the road. Gas and medical supplies are a huge thing in Taiz. They can't carry out surgeries. It's only 2 to 3 semi-functional hospitals, and I mean like maybe at 25% capacity, that's just my guess. I'll give you an example. We've documented cases of the Houthis. Of course, we're not talking about UN aid or anything. These are local efforts of 42 gas cylinders not being let in. The driver gets detained for 2 days. They never give them the gas cylinders. A gas cylinder weighs 70 kilograms, and you needed to carry out any surgeries. So in order to get it through that smuggling route, you need 2 men, and they need 9 hours. to get one into Taz. If you have a camel, it might be able to carry one, and that might be a little bit faster. I think what we can say as a sum up, because Taz is very much on the news, well, for Yemenis maybe, and people who are following the situation, it's not really maybe to the extent of sieges in Syria yet, but given how fast the siege has deteriorated, it will get there much quicker if this continues. The cross point is open, people are coming in and out, but it's just very difficult to do it. And I know that Brian wanted me to kind of address the UK and US role in this conflict. I mean, as Amnesty International, our main call is for the states who are giving the Saudi-led coalition, all the parties to the conflict, weapons, to suspend those arms. If there's any risk, even not proof, risk of those weapons being used to commit IHL or international humanitarian law violations. And of course, Amnesty commissioned an opinion from the Matrix Chamber around a month ago, where this chamber, like a legal firm, basically has come out and said that the UK is basically in breach of its own law, and the arms treaty agreement that they championed basically a couple of years ago. So I think there's something about it in Newsnight. We're trying to lobby some parties, so tune in for Newsnight tonight because Hilary Benn from the Labour Party is coming out and talking about it tonight. I don't know if this was interesting, but I hope it was. I wanted to change things up a little bit from the political side. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating overview of kind of the staggering human cost that I think is not highlighted enough, as you said, the international media. Anyway. So now we'll turn to Nawal, who will give us, I think, a sense of what's next.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say, to be honest. Reprieve, you guys really covered it very, very well. How we got to this point and the situation on the ground now. I'm just going to add a few more points to what you were saying. Of course, the situation in Yemen is really bad, specifically bad in Taz, where the Houthis have held the siege for the last couple of weeks. I went to Yemen a couple of months ago, and I think it was much worse than I had expected before going, because when you have family members in a war zone, you always think they're exaggerating. But then when we went, it was actually really, really terrible. So yeah, of course, for those of you who have read about Yemen, you'd already know this, but Yemen is in the brink of famine. It was already poor before this war, and the situation is only getting a whole lot worse. When we were there, I think we did see food was available. I was in the north, so I spent time in Sana'a, Hajjah, Amran, and then towards Harad. I didn't go to see Taz, so I'm talking specifically about the north, which is only under the Saudi blockade. Taz is under a double blockade from the Houthis as well. And in the north, what we saw is that food is available, but because of the Saudi-led coalition's blockade, that means it's just a whole lot more expensive. So it's more of an economic famine than actual famine that food doesn't exist. People just can't afford to buy food anymore. Some things like the price of oil have increased in time, are 4 times the price than they were before the war. Numbers like the severe acute malnutrition. A lot of people, when I speak to them about Yemen, they say, yeah, but Yemen was, people were poor before anyway. Like, you keep giving us these numbers about the malnutrition rates and the humanitarian situation, but now it's 100 times worse. For example, the severe acute malnutrition numbers have doubled in the last 10 months. But one of the main things I think that we have to think about looking forward are the factors that are going to affect Yemen forever, even if this war does stop. Like I always say, and I know this is going to sound really terrible, but I always say, like, buildings can be rebuilt. People that have been killed in wars, you'll mourn them, and then one day, people get over it. But it's really the social fabric of Yemen that's been completely fragmented in this war that we're never going to be able to kind of patch up afterwards. People are starting to ask each other, where do you come from? What part of Yemen? Are you from the south? Are you from the north? Are you from Taz? Are you originally a Hashimi? Like, these are questions that I was never asked as a Yemeni before this war. And now, because people don't know what position to take, They're starting to look back in their roots and where they come from. And Yemenis are starting to fight with each other. And so it's a really scary thought to think what's going to become of Yemen even when this war stops. Another thing is that new militias are being armed. Of course, the Houthi militia, are very well equipped, thanks to Ali Abdullah Saleh, and handing them over 70% of the best trained and best equipped army. But now also new militias in Taiz and in Aden are being armed by the Saudi-led coalition. And while now they may be fighting the fight with the Saudi-led coalition to push out the Houthis, you have to think about what's going to happen next. What are they going to be doing next? Will they remain loyal to Hadi? I mean, we've already seen in the south that after the Houthis were pushed out, these militias took different sides and no one knows what happened next. Also, you have to think about AQAP and the Islamic State in Yemen. Children are now dropping out of school and joining the fight. I'm going to go back to AQAP and the Islamic State. Children are now dropping out of school and are joining the fight. 71% of the private sector is now unemployed. So that means 71% of the people that used to work in the private sector don't have jobs. So what are these 71% doing? As well as that, 55% of youth that were in higher education haven't gone back to university anymore, and it's simply because they can't afford it. Those who haven't gone back to their jobs is because a big portion of the private sector has just had to shut down because of this war. And that means this gives AQAP and the Islamic State such fertile ground to recruit. People are vulnerable, people don't have jobs anymore, and so they can't bring in money for their families, and then you have AQAP and IS willing to offer them salaries and willing to help them with their livelihoods. So it's very, very easy for them to recruit, and they're expanding at a dramatic scale. And if anything, I think they're the only players in this war that are actually winning. 80% of the population is now food insecure. So that means 80% of 26 million people don't know how they're going to find tomorrow's meal. And of course, going back to the UK and the US involvement, when I went a couple of months ago to film this for Newsnight, we went to investigate the UK and the US role in this war. And before, when I used to go, I always take foreign teams with me to Yemen. And before, and I'm sure Adam can tell you this as well, when you walk around Sana'a with foreigners, people are so happy to welcome them, and they're so excited to huddle around you and to invite you for lunch and for breakfast. Yemenis are very happy to see foreigners around. I know you've heard about the kidnappings and stuff, but that aside, people are really nice to foreigners. It's a very rare occasion. But actually this time was the first time. No, but just generally around the streets, people were really friendly towards foreigners. But this time was actually the first time I've ever gone to Yemen, and I was completely petrified for the foreign team that I had with me. Because when you have bombs falling on your homes, and then you look at the shrapnel that's been left behind, and it says made in the US or made in the UK, you know who's throwing those bombs at you. You know people know. There may be a Saudi-led coalition of 10 countries, but Yemenis know that the UK and US, although they're not officially part of the coalition, that they're playing a vital role in this conflict. And the sentiment towards the UK and the anti-US and UK sentiment is really building. I remember walking around the old city in Sana'a with one of the reporter of our films, Gabriel, who looks very foreign. And he was walking around, and I remember these two kids with their parents running and saying, Baba, look, he's a spy, he's going to tell them to bomb us again. And it was because we were in the old city and it had just been bombed. And of course, they saw a foreigner and they know that the UK and the US is supplying weapons, and so, they were worried. Going to what's next. So I was at the Geneva Peace Talks first round with Adam, actually. And they were just a complete joke. Nothing happened. We had a really good time in Geneva, but no one actually met.
Very devastating.
Exactly. It was actually really depressing because at the time I hadn't gone to Yemen, but my family were still in Yemen. And knowing that people were living, through that situation, and then you have delegations from both sides coming and not taking this seriously and not having any intention to resolve this was depressing on a personal level. But it was fun on a professional level because we didn't have to do much work. On the second round of peace talks, though, I think there were a lot more They were held in a secret location in the mountains of Switzerland. It wasn't kept secret for long. And it was, there was a better planning by the UN envoy towards the peace talks. He had a really good framework in place based on 3 trust building points. He'd been shuttling around Oman, Saudi Arabia, Iran, President Hadi. He met with all the sides, coming up with this framework before the talks happened. But I think when we got to the peace talks, it was apparent that both sides only really came to kind of shut up the United Nations and to distract them with the thought that they actually have an incentive to resolve this conflict when they had no incentive at all. Because whilst they did meet around the same table in the peace talks, what was happening on the ground was completely different. Fighting was still going on. No one respected the ceasefire. The Saudi-led coalition made major advances in the north, and the Houthis were still fighting at the border and fighting in other areas in Yemen. So no one really had an intention of resolving the conflict. But what we have come to realize, we're now 10 months down the line, and there is a stalemate. No one's made any major miraculous advance. More people are dying. The humanitarian situation is becoming more dire. And no one knows what's going to happen next. There isn't a plan B. And whatever plan B the government, or I just came back from a conference in Prague where I spent a lot of time with the Saudis as well, and whatever plan B that they do have just makes me even more depressed, because it's just not going to work. And so, so now 10 months down the line, the thought that a complete military victory on the ground is possible is completely false. It's completely impossible. The only way Yemen is going to get out of this war is through diplomatic negotiations, and UN hopefully broker peace talks that will actually be successful. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, because this is a fight of pride, and no side is willing to step down. And I think, looking to the future, the situation doesn't look very good for Yemen. I'll leave it for the question.
Thank you so much. I was hoping you guys would maybe solve it for us.
Yes.
But we have a question and answer for all of that. But thank you so much. Great overview, and I can't imagine having anyone better to talk about Yemen with us. So now I'll open it up. So you just state your name, affiliation, and brief question, comment. Yes.
Hello, my name is Reprieve. Thank you for providing a very good overview of what's going on. I think someone who's just learning about this. On that note, there's a lot of talk that's been going on about how Yemen is the Middle East's worst humanitarian crisis and whatnot. And the term and the phrase failed state has been thrown around a lot. Now, there's been a lot of critique of that term as being very reductionist, as taking into account issues that you've mentioned, i.e. the Saudis being involved, coalition, so my question is really simple. Do you think that the failed state kind of is a useful analytical category to analyse the current situation?
At the risk of sounding extremely depressing, I think it's not useful, because to describe Yemen as a failed state at this point implies that a Yemeni state exists. And there is no longer, the frameworks of the Yemeni state no longer exist in any meaningful form. You have a legitimate, so-called legitimate president, internationally recognized president. I mean, I don't like the word legitimate just because it's so loaded now, but you have a man who is an internationally recognized president, and then you have state institutions that sort of exist, the bulk of which have been co-opted by, the bulk of the state institutions that do exist have been co-opted by Saleh and the Houthis, so they're not in control of the legitimately internationally recognized president. So it's hard for me to say that a Yemeni state, in the sense of a state that can even be functional, that has the infrastructure enough to be functional, enough to be described as failing, exists. That being, it's remarkable that certain institutions in Yemen have remained in existence to the extent that they are now. The central bank, for example, is still functioning. To some extent, certain ministries are still functioning. But generally speaking, the school system is collapsing, the health system is collapsing, the infrastructure, basic things like roads and road maintenance, electricity, It's, I mean, to some extent, the area where the state or the trappings of a state are most present right now is the city of Mukalla, which is being run by an Al-Qaeda-aligned council. So, I mean, it's tragic because the situation in Yemen at this point has reached a level where it's just almost the level of absurdity. And I think it attests to some extent the failures of the international community, or not like that's a word that I should be using, but the failures of international actors, both regionally and on the global level, to recognize what has been going on in Yemen, and which has been plainly visible for most people going on in Yemen over the past 4 years, before we reach this point where it is far too late.
But for as long as I've been able to read, and every time you read about Yemen, it's on the brink of failure. So Yemen on the brink of failure. Yemen. So if we're ever going to say Yemen the failed state, I think probably now it's the first time that you can actually say it.
I used to critique the whole Yemen on the brink, which seems to be like the favorite title for a good period. I would say from 2005 to 2014, Yemen was perpetually on the brink. Yemen fell off the brink, I would say. I'm trying to think when Yemen fell off the brink. I want to say Yemen fell off the brink on September 21st last year when the Houthis took over Sama. That was the point where you basically, there was a ball lying on the brink. It was kind of like, Messi or somebody. I'm American, so I don't know football guys that well. But one lobbed it over and it went flying off the brink at the speed of sound.
I think it was the second they bombed the presidential palace in Aden.
But then it landed, that's true, it landed on another brink, but then it fell off. Then they lost it.
Sorry, you wanted to say.
No, you have a question.
Sorry to follow up on the conversation. But you said it yourself that this is a discourse that's been going on for a number of years now. Yemen being
on the brink of failure,
being the failed state, whatever that may be. Do you think that's created a kind of laziness within the international community in terms of actually addressing the real issues on the ground? Or do you think that analysis has kind of created the wrong
I
solution?
think that the international community is lazy when it comes to Yemen because they have no interest in Yemen. They only had an interest in Yemen when AQAP was strengthening in Yemen, and the main focus whenever you spoke about Yemen or whenever you read about Yemen, it was about the fight on terror, the fight on AQAP and the Islamic State, and it was because they had no interest in developing Yemen or putting money into Yemen that it created a fertile ground for AQAP to actually have a home in Yemen. And now you have this war, and then this counter-terror war that we've been fighting for the last couple of years is completely ignored. And we're putting, we're making even more of a fertile ground for AQAP and now new groups like the Islamic State to grow within Yemen. Yeah, Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, sorry. Yeah.
I keep thinking
So yeah,
okay, but I think
Anyone else want to add? I definitely used Yemen on the brink as a title for a paper, so I think.
so did I, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm Alex, I'm from the King's Law Studies Department. Just talking about laziness and talking about narratives, I just wonder if you could talk about this whole kind of idea of branding it as a sectarian conflict and what that's actually doing in terms of like international response, because I think in a way that makes us quite lazy because we go, oh, it's eternal tensions that date back such a long time.
I think you're.
Oh yeah, I also gave someone asked this question yesterday in another that I did, so I'm just going to repeat as best as I can remember verbatim. Also, I just graduated from my MA from King's in War Studies, so glad to have something to speak with it. We often hear these sectarian terms utilized to an extent, but what is going on in Yemen is at its essence a turf war. It is a battle for power. It is the fight of a number of different factions, both new, old, emerging, to seize power. In the region, especially at the moment, you do have this sectarian rhetoric going on. And while you do have this, Iran versus Saudi proxy war, which we can acknowledge exists even if it's being exaggerated, this gives a context, one, in Yemen, where what is going on in Yemen, at its essence, has nothing to do with Iran. It has very little to do with Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's obviously relations, particularly with Saudi's long-standing relation with Yemen, but at its essence, this is about a bunch of guys and a bunch of groups trying to hold on to their power, trying to extend their power, trying to hold more land, etc. Money, money, power, respect, to quote the great Missy Elliott. So effectively, we have this larger regional context where you have this sectarian sentiment which is growing, which can be utilized by people on the ground. You have certain groups that can say, we are legitimate, we have to fight the Houthis, and it doesn't matter if we kill civilians because they're all Rawafid. They're all Rafida, they're Majusis, they're Iranian, Safawi, whatever, etc., etc., etc. On the one hand. You have others saying, the Houthis saying we're fighting the Takfiris, and the Daesh, and the Daeshis, and the etc., etc., etc. So, is it about this? Or, is, for example, Ali Muslim fighting the Houthis because they're Iranian? No, he's doing it because they went in and took something that he thought was his. Are the Houthis fighting in Taiz and doing what they're doing because they're fighting ISIS? No, they're doing it because they want power, they want land. There's an extent that there's paranoia about this. The paranoia, for example, from the Houthis that they're facing an American, Israeli, Saudi, Zionist, ISIS, Al-Qaeda conspiracy to destroy the entire world. Yeah, it's there. The paranoia from a lot of people that, Yemen is currently the center of the regional Safawi, Majusi, conspiracy to take over the entire world and destroy Ahl Sunnah through the entire region. Yeah, that paranoia is there too. But at the end of the day, this is something completely different. Something that is, in its essence, a political power struggle. And battle between forces aiming for very different visions of not only who will be ruling Yemen, but what Yemen will look like, and indeed if there even is something called the United Yemen anymore.
If I just can comment on this one, I'm originally from Iraq, so sectarianism is in our life. It's an inherent rhetoric. And what I noticed that from my time first in January in Yemen a year ago to July is that people started asking me which sect I'm from, which was very new for Yemen, because even if you tell them you're Shia or Sunni, they don't know what Shia is. They actually don't know the difference. So I'd be like, oh, I'm actually Sunni. And all the Houthis would be like, oh, so you're not Shia. And I'm like, no, I'm actually from the north technically, so I'm Sunni. Now, if you do go to the ground, I do feel the sectarian rhetoric is not from internally, it's being fed internationally, yes. And people are using it. People don't understand the difference. But when I went to Sada in January versus July, they did a couple of years after the revolution started celebrating Ashura and the 12 verse traditions, which didn't exist prior to the revolution. That was a new practice, and you could see them proceeding, and there's self-flagellation, but they don't particularly know yet what that means and why they've adopted these customs. But that rhetoric is not understood on the ground. It's just being fed, and people are saying things verbatim. That's it.
I would say it definitely eventually it could lead to some sectarian conflict, and yes, that's a factor. But I think Adam did sum it very perfectly. He said that, at the core of it, it's a struggle for power. That's the myth. So the tensions later on would lead to a sectarian conflict. But really, the people are not fighting because those are different sects. It's at the core of it a struggle, definitely a struggle for power.
Maybe a tribal tug of war.
You could say,
But when I spoke about the social fabric fragmentation in Yemen, this is what I mean. So us making it sectarian, this is what Yemen is going to end up paying the price for forever. But like you said, they don't know what it means. They really have no clue. And in Sada, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Houthis, the Houthi group, not Sada as a whole, but the Houthis, they went back to Iran and studied in Iran, the Houthi leaders. And so the Zaydi Islam isn't very Shia, it's closer to Sunni Islam. But because they studied in Iran, their kind of, practice became more 12 Shia. And then they came back to them, were inspired, and they came to the mosques and they were preaching the 12 Shia.
Yeah, and there's even a tension within the Houthi movement about this, because, the Houthi movement was in part seen, and if you're going back, there was certain clerics that were that affiliated themselves with the believing youth, which grew into the Houthi movement to some extent. So now you have, particularly now, in the sense that I would say the vast majority of Zaydis who pride their identity as Zaydis feel themselves under attack now. You now see a lot of Zaydis who really hate the Houthis, but because they feel like this is an attack on Zaydism, and because this has been portrayed in many places as an attack on Zaydism, even if they hate the Houthis for bringing in Iranian, or hate, excuse me, I should be more correct, certain elements within the Houthi movement which have brought in a bit of Iranian influence, they're still standing with them because it's sort of this us versus them mentality, which does attest to the deepening sectarian nature of certain
And then you also have like the international one. They don't understand Yemen, so they don't understand the conflict. So it's very easy to make it black and white.
It's
And
very
to make
direct.
it, yeah. And I mean, I've been to talk after talk where I've seen people from government and and journalists, and they talk about Yemen, and because they understand Syria so well, and because they understand Iraq so well, they try and like make in their heads try and make Yemen into Iraq and Syria, and they'll be like, oh, okay, so the Houthis are kind of like Assad's guys, right? And then please don't try and make Yemen like Syria and Iraq. Fine, learn from the mistakes you made in Iraq and Syria, and don't apply them on Yemen, but don't try and understand the conflict in
Don't draw
Yemen.
parallels.
Yeah, exactly.
Or apply our mistakes in Iraq that were made, or apply mistakes that were made in Iraq and Syria to make them even worse.
Yeah, which is what's happening by the way. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And don't quote Missy Elliott in your paper.
She has some answers. Yeah. Hello, I'm Miranda, and I've recently started working at Mercy Corps, which is an American NGO, and they're present in Yemen. And we've been doing lots of research into drivers for, or propensity for youth to support political violence and radicalisation, and testing some of the assumptions that a lot of think tanks and NGOs hold about economic drivers and about when radicalisation happens and about recruitment. I was just wondering, in Yemen, I know it's vast and complicated, but are there any, do you know anything about the recruitment policies or how strong economics is as a driver, or is it not really known?
I think economics is the main driver. But I mean, I think Baraa will know more about this because he did a lot on Al-Qaeda. But I covered them briefly in 2013, and then now as well when we went to Yemen. And back then in 2013, I felt like they were using, when the US had the drone war in Yemen on the ground, whenever they'd drone a home and civilians would die as collateral damage, AKP would go to the sites and, convince the families to join them as revenge, or also help, for example, in rebuilding the homes or helping them with their livelihood and their income, etc., to recruit. But now in this war, it's definitely the fact that schools have just recently reopened, but a lot of schools have closed down. Universities, a lot of people can't afford to go to university anymore. A lot of people are unemployed. A huge number of people are now unemployed because businesses can't run anymore. And so when you've got groups like AKP and IS offering people salaries and offering people work and just reason to be at the moment, then that's how they're recruiting.
I think I agree. At the core of it, it's very economic. The main problem for Yemen is the economical crisis. And if there's any challenge facing Yemen moving forward, after hopefully this war will end, it's the economical challenge. That's really whatever angle you try to look into Yemen, the economical challenge is in the core of the challenges. Usually, the recruitment benefit from a number of grievances that have accumulated by years, and not followed by a proper reconciliation process with the bereaved communities in general, where they don't feel they're part of a bigger society. They don't feel you have a regime, a government, whatever you name it, is inclusive enough, that is giving them a part of the decision-making process. And it's a number of grievances accumulated together that leads to a militant group, whatever the militant group would be, to start recruiting people. It helped the Houthis very much in Sada because the government neglected Sada. There was some presence of a government in Sada, but as the 6 wars of Sada were developing, the government simply left Sada, just left it by itself. And that left a number of people seeing that there is only one militant group that is actually responding to their demands. When I talk to people in Abyan, as an example, and they make a joke out of that. They say the only time we actually saw electricity in our village was when the unification happened, because they wanted us to see there is a unification, and when Al-Qaeda came to our village. And Al-Qaeda did actually provide electricity for those people. How basic, how simple it is, but that's what people see. They see a group that provided something, some form of judiciary, and some form of law enforcement, and some basic, like really basic services, specifically water, and then if it can, also electricity.
And just to add to that, from the conflict's perspective, the recruitment recently and how the youth are being galvanized to join and pick up arms, you can see it in Aden. I think another factor that adds from the economic to the education to the unemployment rate is that they feel like their local neighborhood is being attacked. So at the forefront, when you go to Aden, you don't see AQAP actually fighting. You see the educated young people. So it might be a doctor who picked up a Kalashnikov, or an engineer who's of the local neighborhood. And they are the ones who are on the receiving end of the fire. And that's why the losses have been so high inside the cities of the youth, actually. Even women have picked up arms now. And I saw it for myself in Aden, and now more and more so in Taz. So even women are included in this equation. And that's not, it's because the lack of security, and they feel that the state of lawlessness and the lack of the presence of state institutions and the government is forcing them into that corner. It's not because they're earning anything. When you talk then about child soldiers, because that's another front of recruitment, and a man becomes a man in Yemen, in their opinion, at the age of 12, and that's when they give them a weapon. Child soldiers do earn money for their families. It might be $50 a month at a push. When you see them carrying books and a weapon in the other hand, it's quite devastating. When you ask them, are they earning money? They said to me, oh, okay, this is in the streets of Sana'a. They say, yes, I get $50 a month and I get an allowance of qat, which is a huge deal, obviously. Mm-hmm. And there are different reasons why they jump, but most of the ones in the south, other than economic education, it's security. You're attacking their neighborhood, they're going to pick up weapons and defend it because there's no one. And that comes back to the legitimacy of the government and their lack of control over the country. Hadi has not absorbed these people into his government and these institutions. So that's why they have picked up weapons since July. Now they're going to be absorbed into those other armed groups. So it's a process.
Hi, I'm Ali from SARS. I just wanted to ask, can we, in terms of the solution, we said, the only way we can achieve anything in Yemen is via negotiations outside of the country. But I want to ask, can we really invite all these parties that have committed war crimes on the ground to discuss how they're going to build a better future for Yemen? And is that going to include Al-Qaeda, because they're controlling part of the months, they're going to include the Saudis, the bombing, and so on?
The question is, can we really invite them?
First you need talks, so why not?
Sorry?
What?
I was making reference to the fact that Al-Qaeda was represented at the first round of Geneva talks, so why can't they be?
Do you remember?
I would not go as far as to say. My government may think that Sheikh Abdul Wahab is. Actually, I shouldn't even say it. Should I?
No.
I'll edit this part out.
It's live streaming, we can't edit live.
Yeah, I know. I mean, okay. So I will answer this I'll actually answer this in a serious way in terms of Martin's, I think, very smart remark. But the fact of the matter is, there has to be some way these people are. You can't just. There has to be not necessarily a way that they're included, but there has to be some way in which these people's. When you speak of Al-Qaeda, the support base has to be co-opted, and whether that means, and that's something that's far more easier said than done. And I think that's something you're not just looking at in Yemen. You're looking at it in Syria. You're looking at that in Iraq. Looking at that across the region. How do you take a group like Al-Qaeda, which has built up a support base, and how do you, and for that matter, other groups that are not Al-Qaeda, that in some areas are even more stronger, whether we're speaking of Salafist militias that may be committing and may have ideologies that are very, I would put it, animic, that are not compatible with
that are not compatible with the vision that most internationally backed parties share. Obviously putting Salafis in one gigantic bench, you have a huge, gigantic amount of diversity within the Salafi community in Yemen. Indeed, you have some Salafis that are bizarrely fighting with the Houthis, fighting along the same side as the Houthis. So, I mean, it raises the question how to move forward. There are so many moving parts in this conflict. It would have been much easier to solve this conflict a year ago. It would have been much easier. I often think that if you went back in time, 2007, imagine if Ali Abdullah Saleh listened to the legitimate grievances of the southern people at that point. If you look back to the early 2000s, what if Ali Abdullah Saleh met with Badruddin al-Houthi right after his son Hussein was killed, instead of just leaving him hanging in Sana'a for so many months? What if 2011 went a completely different way? What if? But the fact of the matter is, we have to deal with the situation now as it is.
And just adding to what you said about people that have committed war crimes coming around the negotiation table, the reality is the actors that are fighting on the ground have to be around the negotiation table for them to stop committing war crimes on the ground. So unfortunately, yes, they do have to be around the same table and they do have to negotiate.
At least they have that in common.
Yes, one thing that Yemen's warring factions share.
Yeah. But one thing is that the solution, whatever it is, it has to be conclusive of all different groups in Yemen. Trying to marginalize one. If we've learned anything from Yemen's history, is that marginalizing any group in Yemen is going to come and bite you in the butt afterwards. So let's not do that anymore. Let's make a solution that's conclusive of all the groups in Yemen.
Hi, my name is Salam. So I was just coming back to Ali's point. Can the solution be done by uniting Yemen? Can we have a solution and the united Yemen?
I really hope so, but after everything that's happened in this war, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for a unified Yemen to remain, but that's my opinion.
Okay. I think Yemen is going to continue united because of many different circumstances, not because of what the people inside Yemen, specifically the southerners, want. But from my point of view, I think if the southerners people don't feel that they want to be part of a unified country, I think for me it's better if they do some process that leads to that peacefully, rather than just going into another conflict and then eventually having the South to separate anyway. Coming back also to Ali's question and your question, Yemen did have similar events in its history. In the 60s, they fought for 7 years, and it was very, like you could say, if you have today Iran and Saudi Arabia, basically behind the scenes, or like whatever you want to call it, back then they actually were the Saudis and the Egyptians fighting inside Yemen. But actually the actual fight was conducted by Yemeni people, leaving to what Nawal was saying, the social fabric was affected. But actually a reconciliation is possible, and it did happen. If there was a proper government and proper leaders after the 60s, a lot of, and as Adam said, what if he listened to the grievances of the South in 2007? They were not calling for secession. So a reconciliation is possible, and it did happen before, and I don't see a reason why it couldn't happen again.
I really hope so, yeah.
And just to add on top of that, just one big factor that will not lead to Yemen splitting into 2 states is Saudi. It's not to Saudi's advantage to have the Houthis rule a northern republic of Yemen on their borders. So that will never happen, ever. Even if all other members of the coalition want it, by the way. There are grievances in the coalition about what UAE and Qatar want and what Saudi wants. If Saudi doesn't agree to it, it's not going to happen. And that's why we won't see 2 states.
I mean, it's better for the Saudis to make the Houthis as one group within many different groups, so their vote doesn't outweigh
yeah.
like the other groups. Better than just having north of Yemen, like specifically in
That's
Sada, very, very anti-Saudi.
That's it. And do you think the panelists have anything else you want to add?
Sorry?
Do you have anything else you want to add? Last words.
Watch Newsnight tonight.
Also, I apologize for running everyone's Wednesday night
I would say
this depressing.
I think
I would say this one thing. I mean, again, is everything is possible. So whether like having a reconciliation government, having something towards working towards the future, I think the most important is how to learn from our mistakes in the past. Whether that was the mistakes, I would say we committed even as youth, the youth revolutionists in 2011, and what are the mistakes happened throughout that period until today. A reconciliation is possible. It happened before, and there is no reason why it couldn't happen again.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.